when I was out there, I was going to loads of local churches, and there were images of white Jesus everywhere. Okay, and this is in today in West Africa. So we need to deal with the legacy of colonialism. And so the questions of Christianity being harmful in terms of it being racist, I think they're generic questions, but actually there's different weight, and there's a lived experience. Dare I say that phrase, because I know some people don't like it, but it's true. There's a lived experience behind that that I think, as I said, the classical model of apologetics doesn't quite respond to.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable.
Welcome to Unapologetic, helping you to understand, defend and share your faith with confidence. I'm Ruth Jackson, and today I am delighted to be joined by Clare Williams, who will be sharing some of her thoughts around race, culture and young people. I'm going to introduce Clare properly in a minute, but I just want to remind you to head over to our website, premierunbelievable.com, to find more shows, articles and resources. And if you register or sign up for our newsletter on the website, then you can get yourself a free ebook. So, back to Clare Williams, who is the founder of Get Real, an apologetics ministry, engaging with the big questions of life, faith and culture. Hi, Clare.
Hi, Ruth. Good to see you again.
So, Clare, October is Black History Month. What does that mean to you? I know you've been doing lots of stuff with your ministry, but what does it mean to you personally, Black History Month?
Yeah, I think Black History Month is a time of celebration. I think over the years, it has been a time of just talking about slavery or just talking about Martin Luther King. But I think there's lots of resources available, lots of new perspectives. And it's a time of celebration. It's not about erasing other ethnicities or groups, but actually about amplifying voices and work and appreciating the work of Black British people who've just made, outstanding contributions to society.
And before we talk specifically about some of the issues that we're going to address in this podcast and over the next few issues of the podcast, would you just share a little bit about your story? How did you get into apologetics? Why did you decide to create Get Real? Did you grow up in the church? What's kind of your faith journey? Just give us a little bit of a potted history of Clare Williams, if you will.
Okay, yeah. So I did grow up in church. My dad was a Jamaican preacher. My parents are from the Windrush generation. So my mum's St. Lucian. I was born here. So Caribbean heritage, and grew up in church, Pentecostal church. Saw a lot of answers to prayers, saw God actively working. But then as I got older, I had my own questions, as many of us do. And then I came to a point in my career, I was a teacher for 10 years, that I had a lot of questions. It was just a perfect storm. Lots of things were going on. And then I left my teaching profession to train in apologetics with OCCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and loved it. Was really just challenged in my faith, but also saw how you can engage with some of your deepest questions. And then as I started to, and I still do very much love the discipline of apologetics, I kind of started to see a bit of a gap in some of the questions that would say the Black British community might ask, that the kind of classical apologetics model didn't necessarily cater to. So seeing that gap, I felt challenged by God actually to try to do something about it as far as I can. And that's where Get Real comes from. So I do look at your sort of general apologetics questions, but also with a particular focus upon questions that emerge from Black British people, Black British millennials in particular, who kind of maybe are on the same journey as I was, questioning their faith or having left the faith, those sorts of kind of places. So that's a bit about what I do.
And do you see that those questions are different, or is it just sort of articulated in a different way?
I think the baggage that comes with them is different. So I remember in 2020, I think it was 2020 June, the activist Sean King tweeted, we need to pull down every image of white Jesus. It's a form of and a tool of white supremacy. And I remember apologists flocked, to the call to answer this question. And many people were saying things like, well, actually, when you look at it statistically, Christianity is not a white man's religion because more people follow Christianity in the global south. And that is factually correct. Okay. But I found my fellow apologists were missing the weight that became behind that question. The symbol of Jesus a Jesus who looks like a Jesus of Norway, as the artist said. I can't remember his name, but Jesus looking very white, very European, comes with a history and a legacy that still continues today. And that's the part that was missed. And so whilst it's true that the majority of Christians are, emerging from the global south today, I actually went to West Africa in 2019 or 2020, I can't remember. I think it was 2019 before the pandemic. And when I was out there, I was going to loads of local churches, and there were images of white Jesus everywhere. Okay. And this is in today in West Africa. So we need to deal with the legacy of colonialism. And so the questions of Christianity being harmful in terms of it being racist, I think they're generic questions, but actually there's different weight, and there's a lived experience. Dare I say that phrase? Because I know some people don't like it, but it's true. There's a lived experience behind that I think, as I said, the classical model of apologetics doesn't quite respond to.
And how do you think we can better understand the cultural legacy of second and third generation Black British young people? Because I suppose in some ways it's quite a new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. For instance, my parents came to this country, and my grandparents came to this country came at a time when I would say racism was very much in your face. Things that they had to deal with was horrible. Even going to church, we all know the story of lots of Black Caribbean Christians being asked not to come back to churches. That's very much a common testimony among Black Christians of the time, 50s and 60s. But now they've had children. They've worked really hard. Their children are going to university, having good jobs, and then their grandchildren are doing the same. And kind of like the legacy of church going is fading out as generations go on anyway. We know that across ethnicities, but also trying to want to be part of British culture and being British by birth, but still having to deal with some of the racist incidents and situations that their parents and grandparents have had to deal with. And that's the place at which I find myself in, and I guess Gen Z as well.
Do you think there's a certain, to a certain extent, that people like you perhaps feel like you maybe don't quite know where you fit, where you belong?
I think that was a very much a thing that came out of sort of cultural studies of between two cultures kind of thing. And I get why some of that was kind of popular in I would say early 2000s and 90s, and I understand that. I think though I'm glad for my parents and my church family and who've really given me a sense of identity. And I think not only does my identity come from my family, of course, but also my identity in Christ. So I think what's happened now, actually, particularly after 2020, and I'm sure we'll get into this, you'll see a lot of millennials in particular, a lot of Gen Z Black young people wanting to get into their roots, wanting to become more familiar with sort of indigenous practices. But and so I can understand what you're saying. I think so. I think that there is an element to that. But I just think about it because there was a part of this in sort of the social sciences and cultural studies where that kind of between two cultures was used almost in a weaponizing way. Anyway, I'm thinking out loud.
It's all really helpful. So I suppose, how do we help young people to engage with their roots like that? And I suppose also at the same time be kind of introducing them to Christianity or reintroducing them to Christianity or correcting kind of misconceptions, all of that while helping them to find their place.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But I think that traditionally the narrative of Christianity, the Christian story as told through the Western lens, has missed out some significant contributions of Black Christians. That's what I'll say, and we'll unpack this, I'm sure, in a few episodes' time. But and I think reclaiming the narrative, and I say that carefully because I saw over 2020 revisionist historians and rewriting history and quotes from 1984 and all that kind of thing. But I think it's the right thing to do, to tell the full story of God's hand at work in human history. Tell the full story. And I think when I became acquainted with how the rich heritage of Christianity among African thinkers in the early church, I was shocked, and I'd never learned about it before. How much more are the young people growing up today?
And so how do you think we keep, those young Black people in our mind when we're doing apologetics, when we're talking about engaging youth culture? How do we make sure that they're, front and center of what we're doing, and we're not just kind of whitewashing in a literal sense, all of the apologetics and the outreach that we're doing?
It's about one of the ways that you can address this is in your talks, okay, in your evangelism, in your group discussions. Is there a diversity of thought in that? I'm not saying like a theological spectrum here. I'm talking about, are there any thinkers that you read that you can quote? Any musicians, any artists, any just thinkers of our day that aren't necessarily white European who have something to say? And there are. And if the answer is no, there aren't, well, you haven't done your homework. I'm sorry. So we need to do our homework and because representation really does matter. And if young people don't see themselves in the story of Christianity, they see themselves as extras on the stage of Christianity, then they will disengage.
Well, and presumably that was part of where Get Real came from, in that it's not just about the people we quote, it's also about the people that you see on platforms. And, sadly, a lot of kind of the history of apologetics has been white middle-aged men, hasn't it? So, how does that speak to a young Black woman who's... what are some of the ways that we can be giving a platform to people who are not white middle-aged men in the area of apologetics?
Yeah, and I think it's about reaching out and engaging with lots of the resources that are out there. So I know you've had her on your Unbelievable and different things like that in the past, but Lisa Fields in America, the Jude 3 Project, is doing some fantastic work, honestly. So engaging with resources that are out there and reaching out to people, I think is one way of doing that.
What has your experience been, being in this world that is sort of predominantly white, predominantly male? Has it been difficult for you to be doing this, or do you feel like actually doors have been opened because of what you're doing, because of the kind of the niche that you're able to speak into?
It's interesting, actually, because when I started this, it was like tumbleweed. I was like, Lord, are you sure? Are you sure? But then 2020 happened. So I started this in 2019, 2020 happened. And then it was like lots of people began to call me, to ask me to speak, to do things. And I had to get myself up to speed, research, learn, lots of things like that. So I've struggled in the sense of, because apologetics leans so heavily on philosophy, which is all about reason, rationality, logic. And those are great things. And I think God has given us that. Yeah. We're meant to love the Lord of all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, all of our being. Sometimes that impetus to want to land upon a indisputable truth without acknowledging the hurt and the pain that some people might experience, that has sometimes been difficult for me to navigate. And, the sense that, if you're asking the question, is Christianity white man's religion, or I don't want to be a Christian because of racism, that isn't a legitimate question. It's not an objection we should take seriously. That kind of attitude has been hard to navigate, but I think it's something that's been understood more.
Yeah, do you feel that the tide is changing, or do you feel like it's still a really difficult area to be speaking into?
I think the tide is changing, I do. And I think it's changing because this question about, let's say, the church's complicity in racism or slavery, whatever, it's not just a question about racism for Black people to address. It's the general, when we look at Gen Z in particular, they don't like anything harmful. So Christianity, apologetics is no longer, is Christianity true or is Christianity relevant? Is it harmful? Is the overarching question of our day. And so if it's harmful in terms of racism, if it's harmful in terms of sexism, and so on, regardless of ethnicity, you're going to find people backing up from the faith. And the sooner we understand that, and not just say, well, drop the hammer of objective truth upon people, but actually say, let's engage. Let me see what I can affirm about your objection to Christianity. I think that's how the tide is going to change.
And you mentioned Gen Z there. That's effectively, I mean, there's sort of, different opinions about who Gen Z are, but it's effectively anyone born sort of mid-90s onwards, isn't it? So you do a lot of engaging with that generation, with young people. I mean, were there questions that you specifically had growing up as a young person yourself? Were there any specific big apologetic questions that you had? What were some of the things that really kind of, you were a pastor's kid, but I'm sure that didn't mean you didn't have questions, because also a pastor's kid also had questions. What were the sort of big things that kept you up at night?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this before in another conversation, but it's definitely the Bible, the trustworthiness of the Bible, legitimacy of the Bible, because particularly in Black Pentecostalism, there is a really high view of Scripture, and we expect that when you open the Bible, God is talking to you, and I've seen God move powerfully in that way in many people's lives, including my own. But when you're confronted with questions about the historicity of the Bible, or the God of the Old Testament, all these other objections, that really did begin to shake my faith, because I have this esteem of the Bible, and I think it is a record of God's work in human history. So that was the big thing for me, the Bible.
And so how did you reconcile that? Because presumably, we've all still got questions, but presumably you've come to a kind of greater understanding of the legitimacy of the Bible. How did you kind of begin to work that out for yourself?
Yeah, I think that, well, the first thing I did was I heard a lecture by a guy called Tom Price. He works for OCCA, Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, about the historicity of the Bible. And he talked about the New Testament and the kind of manuscript tradition, and kind of comparing the Bible to other ancient texts or texts from antiquity, and the copies, all that kind of stuff. And I was just like, why didn't I know about this? I was happy to hear it, but I was also upset, like, why has it taken me this long to know this? But also engaging, I think it's a timeless book. Amy Orr Ewing's book, Why I Trust the Bible, is brilliant. And she's recently revised it. So those two were kind of, like I say, my entry point into apologetics, and being like, oh my goodness, this is great. So that really helped me with my questions about the Bible.
Well, you touched on a really interesting point there, Claire, like, why didn't I know this? And I think that's what lots of people hear, the amount of times people have said, oh, that's the first time I've ever heard that argument, or the first time I've ever seen that evidence being presented. I mean, that's a big issue, isn't it? How do we make sure that some of that stuff that is being discussed in the ivory towers gets whittled down to people just on the street? Have you got any thoughts about how we disseminate that information well?
Yeah, I mean, and this is why I have a passion for young people, because I don't want them to get to the age I was finding this stuff out, or, reading one passage of Scripture that, really makes them feel uncomfortable, and they trade their whole faith in, when actually there are thinkers from ages past who've wrestled with these questions as well. So I think it's about, within our church spaces, having forums where we collect regularly the questions that our young people have, because the questions are always changing. It's always a moving thing, and being able to address them. I'm not saying to do that on a Sunday, but I'm saying there needs to be a forum where we do that. And the thing about young people as well, I've noticed they don't want to be patronized. Equally, they don't want you to act like you're cool and you're one of them, because you're just not. Like, you're not. But they don't want to be patronized. And one of the ways not to patronize young people is to challenge them with challenging material. Say, this academic has this view, or this is a finding, this was a discovery. So challenging, obviously, our young people, but also just the general church congregation, having these spaces where we engage critically and think deeply about our faith.
We're going to be talking a lot more about these sorts of issues in the next few podcasts, but just as we come to the end of this one, as we approach the end of Black History Month in October, are there any particular thoughts you would like to share with our listeners? Any advice, any kind of, I guess this is your opportunity to just offload anything that's on your heart that you kind of wish more people were thinking about.
I think that if you're in a church or in a space where it's maybe not very ethnically diverse, and you might think, well, we don't need to talk about Black History Month here, I would say you do need to talk about Black History Month there. You need to watch a video, read an article, just engage in some way, because, as I said at the start, Black History Month is about celebration and celebrating, the contributions to British history and the present day. So don't think that because maybe you're not a person of colour, or maybe you're in a space that is a white majority space, that you don't have to celebrate, you don't have to do something. Do something. It'll be good. It'll be good for all of us.
Brilliant. Do something. Clare Williams, thank you so much. And thank you for listening to Unapologetic. You can find out more about our guest, Clare, through the links with today's show. And please do let us know what you think of the programme. We like your feedback, whether it's positive or negative. It all helps. You can get in touch over our social media or by emailing unbelievable@premier.org.uk. And do join us next week as we carry on this brilliant conversation with Clare. And we'll be focusing particularly on racial justice and young people.
Unapologetic from Premier Unbelievable. For more shows, resources and our newsletter, visit premierunbelievable.com.